When we talk about us, the people labeled colored, the numbers tell a very different story from the myth. More than 78,000 enslaved people were brought to the Cape before 1808, and over 51% were African. 26% came from India and nearly 23% from Southeast Asia. Now that mix produced at least 7 ancestral groups according to the Lie of 1652, a decolonized history of land. Not one homogeneous identity. Today I'm breaking down the first 3 of those groups, and the data makes one thing very clear. Our roots are far more African and far more global than the colonial records ever admitted. So let's start where every honest story about the Cape should start, with the Khwe and the San, because genetically, linguistically, geographically, this is the deepest layer of who many of us are. By the time the Dutch arrived in 1652, the Khwe and the San communities had already been in the region for thousands of years. They farmed, they traded, moved livestock across routes that Europeans later renamed, as if nothing existed before they arrived. Patrick points out that the early colonial administration didn't just dispossess the Khwe and the San of land, they absorbed them into slavery and forced labor. Over 200 years of war, disease, and coercion effectively pushed many Khwe and San people into the emerging enslaved population. That means that this lineage is foundational. And if you look at the older layers of colored ancestry, the Khwe and the San isn't somewhere on the edge. It's in the bloodstream of our language, our patterns, our surnames, our food, and our survival traditions. Right, now let's talk about the largest single component of our enslaved ancestry: Africans from Mozambique, Madagascar, and the wider East African coast. When you combine the VOC years with the later British era of prize slaves, those are people freed off captured slave ships. Just under 61% of enslaved persons brought to the Cape were from Africa and Madagascar. Think about what that means for us. The so-called colored identity is often described as a mixed group with little African connection, but the data contradicts that completely. Many of our ancestors spoke Makua, Yao, Malagasy, Shona, and languages from inland and Central Africa long before they were forced to adopt Dutch. There's also the Zanzibari component, especially in the 1800s under the British. Hundreds were brought as prize slaves to the Cape and Natal. Many were Muslims. Some became indentured laborers in the sugar industry, and in KZN they form a distinct Zanzibari community. In the Cape, however, they were absorbed into the colored category. This migration wasn't neat, it wasn't slow, it wasn't small, it was very large, it was violent, and it shaped who we are. The third group are people enslaved from across Southeast Asia and India. This is where we get labels like Madikers, Malay, Amboinese, Bengali, K-word, and so on. But let's strip away the colonial distortion. The term Cape Malay is largely a constructed identity. Only a small percentage of enslaved people actually came from Malacca, or today known as Malaysia. Most came from Java, Banda, Bali, Makassar, Bengal, and Sri Lanka. So why were they lumped under Malay? Because the colonizers thought they spoke variations of Melayu trade languages used across the shipping routes, not because they actually came from one place. Some were Muslim, but many weren't. Some were political exiles, and some were children stolen in war. And over time, they merged into the Creole world that became early Cape society. The key point is this: this group was large, diverse, and deeply embedded in South African culture through food, music, spirituality, and resistance tradition. When you hold these first 3 groups together, the Khwe and the San, the diverse enslaved Africans, and the Southeast Asian and Indian enslaved communities, you start to understand why the old narrative of colored equals mixed is historically empty. There were multiple indigenous and global identities colliding under extreme violence, producing a new Creole culture that colonial governments later tried to flatten into one category. So the truth is complex, but the truth is ours. Over the next few videos, I'll continue unpacking the other 4 groups that Patrick identifies in the book, so we can build a clearer picture of our heritage based on evidence, not stereotypes.